start everything with prayer. So we're going to start with O Heavenly King, and then get started with this. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. O Heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. I'll just say a few words by way of introduction. I first met Dr. Kenworthy this past March. He had come to Chicago for a conference in which I think a half dozen speakers gave presentations, and his was among the half dozen. And he spoke on St. Tikhon, Patriarch of Moscow, and he's publishing a book which is going to be coming out in about 2 weeks, unless it's already come out.
A little delayed, probably December.
Oh, December now. Okay, so he's keeping us on the edge of our seats, waiting for this book. It's a book about St. Tikhon, the people's patriarch. It tells the story of St. Tikhon, who became the first patriarch of the restored Russian Orthodox Church in 1917, just days after the Bolshevik Revolution. And as all of you know from homilies I've given in the past, St. Tikhon was here in Chicago. He was actively involved in building Holy Trinity Cathedral, along with another saint that we're celebrating this week, Father John, St. John Kachurov. And I was telling Dr. Kenworthy that I grew up looking at pictures of Father John, who was actually the founder of my home parish in Joliet. So I feel a strong connection, at least to Father John, and by way of Father John through the patriarch. So we're very happy. Dr. Kenworthy suggested that he could come visit us today because he gave a presentation at the cathedral yesterday. They're celebrating St. John Kachurov month, this month in October, so he was here to talk about Patriarch Tikhon. I'll just give you a little bit of background. Dr. Kenworthy is professor in the history department at Miami University of Ohio, where he also teaches for the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies and Religious Studies programs. He's the author of the prize-winning book, The Heart of Russia, Trinity St. Sergius, Monasticism and Society, after 1825. And together with Alexander Agagyan, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Understanding World Christianity, Russia. He's a past president of the Association for the Study of Eastern Christianity and has held research fellowships in the U.S., Germany, Hungary, and Romania. So without any further delay, I give you Dr. Scott Kenworthy.
Father Alexander, brothers and sisters, Christ is in our midst. Thank you for hosting me. It's really nice to be in this beautiful church. You guys are lucky to have such a nice church. I feel a bit at home because you have the same iconographer painted your iconography, Father Andrew, who painted the iconography of my home parish, which is in Cincinnati, Ohio. So it feels familiar in some ways. And Father Alexander and Father Stephen were at seminary together, so it's a similar spirit, I think, to our two parishes. So I'm going to speak to you today about St. Tikhon, who is very important to us as an American saint, but also very important because of the role that he played when he returned to Russia and became patriarch in 1917 for the very same moment that the communists had seized power in Russia and were trying to essentially destroy the church. And so he was immediately thrust into a position of defending the church doubly important saint. And, thinking of saints and our approach to saints, so many of the ancient saints of our church, wonderful as they all are, there is a certain stylization to writing saints' lives. You read about their childhoods and how they were pious and loved to go to church and didn't play all the games that the other kids played. And, there's a sort of scripted story of many saints' lives, and maybe they don't always speak to us today because it feels so distant. But with St. Tikhon, he's somebody of our own times. He died exactly 100 years ago in 1925, so this is the centenary of his repose. And he had confronted with so many issues that are concerns to us still, from religious diversity and pluralism to relating the church to democracy, to situations of political polarization and hostile governments and things like this. And also because we have such a rich access to his own personal letters and statements by him and things like this, we can see him as a person in many ways and how he grappled with really challenging questions that I think makes him especially relevant to our own times to think about. As Father Alexander mentioned, I have my book is coming out hopefully by the end of the year, so I left some flyers in the back. You can get a discount. Go to retake that. Hopefully there's enough copies. They actually, Oxford University Press often charges a lot of money for books, but they price this one right, so it's reasonable. And don't be scared away where it says 440 pages. It is a long book, but at least 100 of that is footnotes and bibliography and stuff, so it's not quite that long. But it's a biography, but it's also a scholarly book in the sense that I really grappled with all of the sources that I could have access to for his entire life. So St. Tikhon was born Vasily Ivanovich Golovin, January 19th, 1865, in a tiny village in northwestern Russia, the village of Palatine, where his father was the parish priest. It was very humble beginnings. The village was very poor, and his family had to work the fields just like the peasants did that they lived among. When he was 4 years old, Vasily was 4 years old, his father was transferred to the town of Toropets, also in the same sort of general part of Russia, northwestern Russia, a town of about 10,000 people, reasonably prosperous with some beautiful stone churches and things like that. Lovely pair of lakes. It's a really pretty place. It still is, by the way. And so then life was a bit better, let's say, in this town where he grew up. Spent most of his childhood. In 19th century Russia, it was typical for the sons of parish priests to follow in their father's footsteps. And so much so that they had created a whole school system from the elementary school all the way through the seminary, which was the equivalent of high school, and then for the best students, the theological academies, which was the equivalent in the university. This whole schooling system from beginning to end just for the sons of clergy. Right? And so he attended the school, the elementary school that was in his hometown of Toropets, before going to Pskov, sort of the major city of the region, where he went to seminary. And then after finishing the seminary, where he was one of the top students, he went to the Theological Academy in St. Petersburg, where he studied in the 1880s. And he was described by some of his fellow classmates later on as being outgoing and friendly, simultaneously a serious student, but also one who was very sociable and engaged with his friends and things like this, and also did love the church and the beauty of the liturgy and everything else. His classmates in the seminary nicknamed him the Hierarch, which was kind of unusual, but even more prophetically, his classmates in the Theological Academy nicknamed him the Patriarch, when So it's important to recognize not only how striking that is, because how prophetic, but there had not been a patriarchate at all in Russia in nearly 200 years. It had been abolished by Peter the Great in his westernizing reforms around the year 1700 was when the last patriarch had died. So, in the 1880s when he was a student, nobody could envision there even would be a patriarch, let alone that Vasily Balavin would be it. Right? It's very striking. And they did this because of their respect for him, and there was something about his person that attracted people to him. It was not unusual for students in the Theological Academy to, if they decided that they wanted to choose let's say, a church career path that involved ending up as a bishop, to take monastic vows to become celibate while they were still students at the academy, and then they would move up into the ecclesiastical hierarchy gradually until they became bishops. But Vasily Balavin decided he was not ready to take that momentous of a step yet, and he's still in his early 20s at this point. So he chooses to return to his alma mater, the Pskov Seminary, as a teacher of theology. So he returns and teaches theology there for several years. Before then, he makes the decision to take vows of celibacy. And then at that point, shortly after, he's ordained to the priesthood, and then transferred and ultimately made the rector or dean, the head of the seminary in Holm, which is today Helm in the eastern part of Poland, but at that point was the westernmost part of the Russian Empire. And it was a fairly complicated region. It was an area where former so-called Uniates or Greek Catholics had lived, who had been brought into the Orthodox Church, some willingly, some not so willingly, only about 17 years before, so there was still that kind of legacy of their transition from being Greek Catholics to being Orthodox. There was also a lot of Poles, a lot of Jews. It was a very mixed region. So it was a pretty daunting task for him as still a relatively young man, in his late 27 years old by this point, to be taking on this kind of role. But apparently he did it in a way that won the respect and love of the people. He kind of combined defending orthodoxy, but not forcing these people who were used to some other kinds of traditions to, crucify their traditions in any way. So much so that at the end of, in 1897, he was made bishop for the region. His title was the Bishop of Lublin, also in eastern Poland today, but part of the Russian Empire then. But he's there for less than a year before he was appointed to become the Bishop of North America. And again, this was a moment in the 1890s when there was a huge influx of Greek Catholics converting to Orthodoxy in North America. So his long experience of that entire group, that population in Holm, kind of readied him, or I assume the church administration, the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was the governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church, decided he would be the right person to send to North America. But think about it, he's 33 years old, and he's been appointed to the largest diocese in the world, the entirety of North America, because at the point he came, there was only one Orthodox bishop, period, in the entirety of North America, and he was it. So Orthodoxy in North America, as I'm sure most of you are familiar, begins in Alaska already at the end of the 18th century, when Alaska was sold to the United States in 1867. The Russian Church administration made the decision to transfer the diocesan see, the bishop's residence, from Sitka, where it had been, to San Francisco, for reasons to be sort of on the mainland of the United States, for in case they needed to communicate with the government or kind of official representation and whatnot. But at the same time, you hop on a boat and you can get to Alaska reasonably easily. Right? So that was, San Francisco was kind of a compromise solution. But still, for decades after that, the main presence of Orthodox Christianity was still in Alaska. There was only small handfuls of Orthodox Christians in the rest of the United States. The 1890s is really the time when that begins to change rapidly, where there's massive immigration. And they're very few actual Russians that are coming. It's mostly people from the Austro-Hungarian Empire or from the Ottoman Empire. So a lot of Serbs, a lot of Syrians who are from Syria or Lebanon, a lot of Rusins who are coming from the Carpathian Mountains regions and things like this, who usually came over as Greek Catholics, but Eastern Rite Catholics, and so when they came to America, they didn't find very welcome reception among the Roman Catholic bishops, who said, "Oh, just go to your local Polish church," and they're like, no, this is not what we're used to at all. So that's when they started converting to Orthodoxy on a massive scale. So that just, in the 1890s, the situation of Orthodox Christianity in the United States changed very dramatically, just at the moment when he arrives. When he he comes to New York, he travels across the country, and comes to San Francisco in December 1898, and gives really a very striking speech for his first speech in San Francisco as the bishop, where he told the people that he invited them, effectively, both the clergy and the lay people, to become his co-workers in building up the church. He said to the clergy, "You know the land here and the people and the situation better than I do, so I want you to be my advisors and help me understand and make decisions and things like this." And to the faithful, to the lay people, he invited them to be his co-laborers, offering him their assistance in building up the church. He drew on St. Paul's image of the church as a body, and said that though not every member of the church has the same function, the same role, that it was everyone was necessary and could not exist without the other. So he called upon the faithful to work together with him in building up the church. And he quoted John Chrysostom and said, "Not to put everything on the clergy, for, quote, you yourselves can do much. You know one another better than we do." And so it's important to understand that in 19th century Russia, bishops carried an enormous amount of authority, and people related to bishops, it was definitely, sort of obedience was all the bishop would ask for, and usually the way, especially clergy would sort of approach the bishop with a bit of fear and trembling and things like this. So, and bishops were usually not very approachable by ordinary lay people. And so for a bishop to be showing up and saying, you are my co-workers, like it's a kind of degree of equality that was very striking for the time. And he would carry this out in the way he did everything that he did while he was in North America, and really continued to do that after he returned to Russia. His first trip eastward in 1899 included visits to Minneapolis, Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York, and he writes, so when he was in Poland, his sort of superior was the Archbishop of Warsaw. His name was Flavian, and so he would write Archbishop Flavian these letters from America, which are an incredible source because it's the one source where I really get at his personal feelings and what he's trying to do and what are his frustrations and his hopes and all these kinds of things. It's quite extraordinary. So he writes back and says, "My diocese is almost boundless. I have inspected all of 4 parishes and have already had to travel by railroad more than 5,000 kilometers. As big as Russia is, North America for a single bishop was even more extraordinary. On the way back, he traveled through Galveston, where there was also an Orthodox community, and then returned to San Francisco in June and stayed for about 10 days before hopping on a boat and going up to Alaska and traveling all around the Alaskan islands and things like this. And this became his pattern, is that pretty much every year, especially the first 5 years that he was in North America, he would literally spend half of the year on the road. Right? And those who travel know how exhausting that can be. Imagine traveling at the turn of the century when you're traveling by railroad and boats and horse-drawn carriages and things like this. And, you know, frequently just spending a few nights in each place before then moving on to the next one. And he was just tireless in his efforts to travel everywhere that there were Orthodox Christians in North America, and if they, especially if there was already a community that was established, and if a congregation was there, but they needed to build a church. So I spoke yesterday at quite length specifically about his work building the Holy Trinity in Chicago, because that was really, really important to him. There were two churches that were especially important to him, that is, I call them church buildings, which was Holy Trinity in Chicago and St. Nicholas in New York on 97th Street, because two of the most important cities, that at the point when he arrived, both of them were worshiping in rented houses, basically, rented buildings that were way too small for the number of people they had, and also this sort of sense of, you know, Orthodox Christians should have churches that look like churches in these two most important cities. So, for example, with Chicago, he came just to visit with the building committee to inspect the plots of land. It was actually, he was the one who made the final decision to choose the plot of land where it is currently built. One of the main supporters at the time was the Russian consul in Chicago, who wanted them to be, you know, more in downtown, where it was kind of, you know, fancier part of town. And St. Tikhon thought, well, it's not really where people live, and they don't really have the money to sustain that. It doesn't really make sense. So he liked where it is located, and it was he supported the rest of the building committee that also liked that place. And then later on, he would come out to, he even made some special trips from Chicago, from San Francisco all the way to Chicago to meet with the architect, Louis Sullivan, to go over the plans, to go over the estimates of how much it was going to cost and what it was going to look like and all this kind of stuff. So very hands-on and really dedicated, but at the same time never in a way where he pushed his opinion over others. He was always working together with the people in the parish and with Father John Cutchgrove and so on to do this. In addition to making all of these travels around to cities like Minneapolis and Chicago and New York and so on, he also traveled extensively in Alaska. He went to, we were praying this morning for the Alaskans in the Kuskokwim Yukon Delta region. There was a big storm a few weeks ago, so he went deep into that region where no Orthodox bishop had ever been before, because it's so inaccessible, it's so difficult to reach, that he spent weeks kind of traveling up the river to this furthest point, and so on, where he said we traveled across the sort of portage trails where basically we only met bears and endless mosquitoes. So, really like adventurous in his travels, and he would travel on mail boats from island to island, and every time the mail boat would stop, if there was at least some people there, even if it wasn't a church, but even just a chapel, he'd get off and go meet the people and talk to them and say a prayer with them and things like this. But by the end of 5 years in North America, he was exhausted, right, as we can understand, because it was overwhelming, because it was such a heavy influx of new immigrants coming into the eastern part of the United States, and Alaska had its own challenges that he felt like he couldn't handle it all. One person couldn't handle it all. And so he went back to Russia. His brother died, so his youngest brother came with him to North America, and his brother died. All of his brothers actually died Russia. His two older brothers. So his youngest brother died in San Francisco while he was in the East Coast, and he was kind of really, shaken up by that as well. So he applied for a sort of a vacation, a leave of absence to go back to Russia to bring his brother's remains and bury him, and I think also just to get a little relaxation. But when he got back to Russia, he didn't get some relaxation. They put him on the Holy Synod to serve on the Holy Synod, but he used that as an opportunity to further the mission in Russia. In the United States. For there was a moment where he was considering that he didn't even really want to come back because he was so exhausted by everything. But once he got back to Russia, he develops this vision for the American church that he kind of sees through the foundational parts when he's back in Russia and can present his case to the Holy Synod, and then does come back to North America for 3 years to start, just accomplishes an amazing amount of things in 3 years after he returns. So the first piece of the puzzle is that, as I said, he came to the conclusion that it was just simply too much for one bishop to be able to attend to the needs of Alaska and attend to the needs, especially of all the immigrants which are coming in the eastern part of the United States. So he, with some effort, pushed the rather reluctant Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church to assign a bishop for Alaska. And so he finally gets them to agree to this. So they appoint a bishop, they assign a young bishop who is going to be the bishop for Alaska. And then he can really concentrate his energies on the lower 48 and on Canada. He's also the first Orthodox bishop to visit Canada. He goes into these tiny villages in Alberta and Saskatchewan and things like this. And so once he gets the bishop for Alaska, then he can transfer the bishop's residence from the cathedral from San Francisco to New York, which will then make his life a lot easier to be able to travel, especially because most of the Orthodox Christian immigrants are in the eastern half of the United States. That would make his or not just his, but any future bishop would make their efforts a whole lot easier. And he was able to do that because, like building Holy Trinity, he was also equally involved in building the St. Nicholas Cathedral on 97th Street, as I said, in New York. So he was able, there was a church there that he could then transfer the bishop's residence to New York. And when this bishop from Alaska first arrives in New York, the two of them together consecrate the first bishop consecrated on American soil, which was Raphael Hallowini, who was also a saint in our church, who was himself from Syria and was consecrated a bishop for the Syro-Arabs, as they called them in those days, Orthodox Christians in that region. And one of the things that he articulated very clearly in 1905, he writes this report back to Russia, where he says Orthodoxy is Catholic, right? As in the sense that it's universal. It's not just Russian. And there are Serbs, there are Syrians, there are Romanians, right? There are Greeks, although the Greeks tend to ignore him. They ignore the Russian bishop. That's another story. They would just write back home for their bishops, and if they needed a priest or something like that, kind of ignore the Russian bishop. But the Serbs and the Syrians both looked to the Russian bishop for helping them get priests and for the antimons and the myrrh and things they needed from a bishop. And so he created this vision of Orthodox Christianity in North America that would encompass all of the different ethnic or national church traditions, and each could have their own priests and even their own bishops, but it would still be one Orthodox church, right? Kind of overarching. And this ultimately was the vision that was behind the foundation of the Orthodox Church in America in 1970. 1970 when it was established. It was this vision first articulated by St. Tikhon in 1905. So to that end, he consecrates Raphael Hallowini as a bishop. He appointed St. Sebastian Devovich, Serb, to head kind of internal mission to the Serbs in North America, also a saint in our church, also connected to Chicago, although originally from San Francisco. And so he never got to the point where he was consecrated, St. Sebastian was consecrated a bishop, but that was the plan. It just didn't work out for a variety of reasons. So that was a major part of his vision for North America, but also he realized that the church was growing so rapidly that it needed priests, right? And that the tradition had always been, because priests had to have a seminary education, the only place to get a seminary education for the Orthodox was in Russia, so they would have to get priests from Russia. But often they didn't, or if it was the Serbs or the Syrians, sometimes they could try to recruit them from those places. But that was challenging for all sorts of reasons. Not a lot of Russians necessarily wanted to come, or if they came, they didn't always come for the right reasons, or it was hard for him to know what kind of people he was getting and things like that. So he says, we need American-born people, Orthodox Christians, to become priests. So he establishes the first seminary in the United States, in Minneapolis at that point, also at this point. The future Metropolitan Leonti Krukevich was brought over by St. Tikhon to be the first head of that seminary as a young priest in 1905. Among other things, of course, an important institution for Orthodox Christianity is monasteries. Monasticism is an important facet of spiritual life. He establishes the first monastery in the United States, in St. Tikhon's in Pennsylvania, which is still there, also around the same time. So he accomplishes all these really amazing things in a relatively short time while he was in North America. And then before he leaves, the last accomplishment was, let's say, putting some institutionalization to this vision of everybody's participation in church, which is the notion of conciliarism, that orthodoxy is conciliar, that is that we have the voice of, it's not the Pope who tells us everything, right? But rather it's everybody together. We have all our voices heard. So he convenes the first council in North America in 1907, which is now referred to as the First All-American Council. Father Alexander and I were both at the All-American Council in Arizona this past year, which sort of sees itself in continuation from that first council that St. Tikhon convened in 1907. So he returns to Russia in 1907, just shortly after this council, and is made Archbishop of Yaroslavl, in kind of the center of Russia, a very nice diocese. He was very happy there because he didn't have to travel so much, and it didn't have so many needs of the churches. If you've ever seen pictures of the churches in Yaroslavl, they're just fantastically beautiful. So he was there from 1907 to the end of 1913. The beginning of 1914, he's transferred. It's not unusual for the way the Russian Orthodox Church worked in 19th and early 20th century Russia. The bishops were transferred fairly frequently. It was just the way it worked. And so he was transferred to be the Archbishop of Vilnius in Lithuania, which was also at that point part of the Russian Empire. But again, a complicated place because the Orthodox Christians were a minority. It was mostly Catholic. The city of Vilnius itself was majority Jewish. So he had to learn how to navigate these complicated and diverse religious contexts, which of course is familiar to him from having spent so much time in North America. And somehow struck this remarkable balance of feeling like having religious others feel like he respected them and tolerated them, but the Orthodox Christians also feeling like he was their defender. Right? So it was a very challenging kind of balance, but somehow he managed to do it. Then in the summer, so in February, March 1917, there's the first revolution in Russia. which leads in March 1917 to the fall of the monarchy, the collapse of the monarchy. And so this initiates not quite a year of Russia trying to establish democracy. In the Church Council, there have been problems and tensions in the Russian Orthodox Church for decades, and it had been wanting to establish, to convene a church council, potentially to reinstate the office of patriarchate, among other things, but also there was many other issues of reform that they wanted to examine and look at in church life. And so the Tsar had prevented them from convening this council because he didn't want them to restore the patriarchate, because that would give the church more independence vis-a-vis the state. And so they had to wait until after the monarchy fell, and then that's the first thing they do, is they start planning for this church council. Also, there was some moments where if a bishop's see was empty, was vacant, they would hold elections, because it's a kind of democratic moment in Russia in 1970. They would hold elections, so they held elections to choose the Archbishop of Moscow in the summer of 1917, and they chose St. Tikhon. So he was popularly elected by this Congress. It was the first time that, probably the only time that ever happened in history, where he was seen as somebody who, because of his time in North America, was sympathetic and understood democracy, so he would be somebody who would support that in the church and in Russia in 1917. But at the same time, somebody who was kind of independent. He didn't bow the church to politics of any sort, either left or right. He was somebody who always kept the church independent, which was appreciated by people on both sides of the political spectrum. In fact, there are newspaper reports when he's elected from both conservative ones and the progressive ones that are like, he's the right man for the job. So imagine that today, right? Finding somebody who both conservatives and progressives can be on board with and say, this is our man. That's the kind of person he was. But then, only a few months later, the democracy, for a whole variety of reasons in Russia, is not quite taking root, and the most radical militant group, the Bolsheviks, seized power in October 1917. The Church Council had been going for 2 months by that point, and had pretty much come to the consensus that they should reinstate the patriarchate. But the very first meeting after the Bolsheviks had seized power in Petrograd, they decide, yes, we need to do this, so they reinstate the patriarchate, and then they proceed, and within the next week to hold elections. Kind of interesting and complicated procedure. They decided to take the names of the 3 people who received the most votes, and then choose one by lot to pick the person who would actually be the patriarch. So it's kind of like the democratic voice of the people, but also the hand of God was making the final choice. And they did this, I think, partially because the elections were pretty polarized. Actually, Tikhon only got the 3rd most votes, and the other 2 figures were sort of much more prominent and published a lot. They were sort of more public persons than he was. He was always sort of more humble and mild, and wasn't putting himself out there. But that meant that those other 2 people were sort of also more prominent, but also more polarizing, right? Someone, Anton Kharpovitsky, who becomes the head of the church abroad after the revolution, was a very popular figure, but also, as I said, very polarizing, right? And again, St. Tikhon is somebody that everybody felt like they could be reconciled with when it was his name that was chosen. But then, as I said, he's immediately thrust into this position of defending the church, so that Soviet regime was atheist, and not only disestablished the church, that is, separated the church from the state, but actually sought to dismantle the church and uproot the Orthodox faith from the people, to instill atheism. And this included not only sort of atheism and education in the schools and things like this, but directly assaulting. They had this campaign against saints' relics and, all these kinds of things. And there was any clergy who criticized them could be arrested, sometimes, especially like Father John himself, shot by the revolutionaries and things like this. So it was an incredibly intense moment. And so for the next half of my book is really about the period of his patriarchy, because it's immensely complex. And among other things, they have released and was published the secret police file on him, like a 1,000-page collection of documents, and also the papers of the Politburo, which was the ruling decision-making body of the Communist Party at the time. So basically the internal correspondence and resolutions and stuff with Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin and all these kind of people. So I pieced together all of this evidence, and it's a pretty remarkable story. But he tries to find this balance where he's not directly, he's not calling for the overthrow of the regime. He doesn't even attack the Soviet system per se, but he's criticizing their assaults on the church. So he's not attacking them, he's defending the church. That makes sense. But, they saw any criticism as counter-revolutionary, and were looking for ways to try to silence him, because he's such a prominent person, right? He's the head of the Orthodox Church, which at the time had maybe 100 million or tens of millions of Orthodox Christians living in Russia, but also kind of international stature. They couldn't just shoot him like they did many of their opponents. And so they were looking for ways to be able to either put him on trial or something like this. That moment comes in 1922 when they have this campaign to confiscate church valuables like chalices and things like this, because they had claimed that it was for famine relief. And he said, we're trying to cooperate with the famine relief, but there are some things we can't give up because if they're consecrated and used in the sacraments, those we, can't force us to give those up. And so there's some clashes between Soviet authorities who are trying to confiscate these things and believers who are trying to defend their churches. Believers are killed in these clashes and so on. And they say, aha, see, he's promoting counter-revolution. Now we can prove it, because people are defending their churches. They're rising up against the government. So they arrest him. He's held at the Donskoy Monastery, but effectively, house arrest. But he's isolated in these 2 rooms for over a year while they prepare this trial against him. There are repeated interrogations, and these interrogation records are also part of this file that I worked with. And they announced in the spring of 1923, they announced that they were going to put him on trial. It was obvious what the outcome was going to be. In other words, they were going to find him guilty and shoot him. There was enough international pressure that began to, a lot of criticism in the global press about this, so that the foreign minister submitted a report to the Politburo and said, this is going to look really bad if we shoot him. At least take the death penalty off the table. And the Politburo met and they said, no, the enormity of his crimes is such that it must have the most severe level of punishment. But because the Politburo is this is the Communist Party, right? They're the sort of body that dictated to the organs of government what to do, but the government was supposed to be implementing these things without dictates. That was supposed to be the appearance. So this decision of the Politburo that he was essentially to be executed was supposed to be transmitted orally by Stalin to the judge in the case that was appointed to oversee. They couldn't put it, they didn't want to put it in writing, right? This is all top secret. But the outcome of the trial was to be determined before he was even put on trial, right? But they had set a date, they even issued tickets because there was supposed to be a limited audience, right, for this trial. When the Archbishop of Canterbury and the chief rabbi in England and a number of other heads of various or leading representatives of churches in England issued a very powerful statement in Patriarch Tikhon's defense. The Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople similarly issued a very powerful statement in his defense. And at this point, the international pressure was becoming too much. And so the Soviet government then said, okay, we've got to put a pause on this. And then the final step was the foreign minister of the UK issued this ultimatum, which had to do with a series of points, but one of those series of points was Patriarch Tikhon, that if he was to be executed, the trade relations between England and Soviet Russia would be terminated. And this was, 1922, 1923, the Soviet Union was recovering from years of war and civil war and everything else, so the country was on the verge of collapse, and they said, we can't afford that. So, okay, let's find an off-ramp from this. And so they managed to get him to issue this statement that he's not an enemy of the Soviet government, that they hoped would sort of make people lose faith in him, that somehow he'd been compromised or broken. And it's like, that'll be even better than making a martyr of him, as to compromise him and people will just lose faith in him. That way it didn't work, that people understood why he issued that statement. So in the meantime, one last piece of the puzzle is that when he spent this whole year under house arrest, the Soviets found some Orthodox priests who were willing to effectively collaborate with the Soviet government and declare their loyalty to the Soviet Union and to promote the cause of communism and things like this. And so while he was under arrest, they prevented any other of the bishops from stepping into his place that he had designated to do that. And instead, these sort of collaborationist priests took over the reins of the church. They were called the Renovationists, or the Living Church, because they also had these ideas of kind of more radical reforms within the Orthodox Church. And so the church in that year when he was under arrest gets split effectively, and these Renovationists are in control of most of the church administration and apparatus, not just centrally, but in the dioceses and everything. So when he finally does get released in June 1923, he spends the last 2 years of his life trying to rebuild the church from this schism, and is fairly successful in doing so. The people quickly realize that these Renovationists are compromisers. They're not the real deal, and they flock back to the Patriarch Tikhon. But all of this time of interrogation, and all the people around him kept getting arrested, and sometimes shot, sometimes sent to Siberia, or sent to prison camps and things like this. It took its toll on his health, actually. So he suffered some kind of it's not clear exactly what, seizure or something like this at the end of 1924, and spends the last several months of his life in this clinic in Moscow, and finally passes away in April 1925. So he's, for the rest of the Soviet Union, he was an enemy of the people, right? He was somebody you couldn't talk about. But in 1989, under Gorbachev, there was this kind of relaxation. He's canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church. So, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
So how did he fund some of the building initiatives that he did in North America with the seminaries and the churches and
That's a good question, because funding was a constant issue. So and with a lot of things, they were sort of on a shoestring budget. The story of the Holy Trinity in Chicago is a particularly interesting one, tragic in some degree, that when when the community had finally raised and saved up the money to build the church, the, in Russian they call him the starosta, church warden or something like this, but I guess you'd call it the treasurer, disappeared with the money. And this was a really devastating blow to the community, as you can imagine. At that point, St. Tikhon was another occasion when he had to make a special trip out to Chicago, because there was one guy in particular who blamed Father John Couture for this. He said, you trusted him with the money, maybe you're in league with him, this kind of stuff, and was trying to split the community, antagonize the community against Father John. St. Tikhon had to make a special trip out and say, first of all, defend Father John. He kind of confronted that guy, and put him in his place, and reconciled the threatening divisions in the parish, but also said, I'll write to the Holy Synod in Russia, I'll get them to loan us the money, we'll be able to move forward, and things like this. And there was a wealthy industrialist in Chicago, Charles Crane, if anybody's heard of him. He's kind of a Russophile character who donated a lot of money for that church in Chicago. Also, I think some for the one in New York. But also, Father John Couture actually went to Russia and spent 6 months in Russia, traveling all around Russia to gather money. Tsar himself made the first donation of 5,000 rubles, and then later on, to finish it off, donated another 3,000 rubles. I think it was like 2 rubles to the dollar back then, so fair amount of money. The famous priest, also now Saint John Kronstadt in Russia, was the first one who met with Father John Couture and said, made a donation, but also proclaimed publicly that supporting the building of the church in Chicago was a holy deed. And so he, managed to gain quite a lot of money from it. But that was a special case. They did that. The churches in New York and Chicago were special in the case that the Tsar donated a significant amount of money, that Charles Crane did, and that both Father John Couture and Father Alexander Kotzebitsky, who was the priest of the church in New York, made these trips to Russia and got the money and stuff. For things like the seminary, they would get, for institutional purposes, they might get money from Russia to do that. That's why when 1917 happens, and the church in Russia itself is in such, crisis, that it's also a crisis for the Orthodox Church in America too, because all the funding disappears immediately, right? And that causes lots of problems here as well. But in most cases, it was just faithful who were usually not wealthy, right? People came over, immigrants came over to work in coal mines and factories and things like this, but they would work hard and save up and build their churches and stuff like that. Yeah.
How much influence did St. Tikhon have on Isabel Hapgood's translation into English? I think it was 1906.
Yeah. So that project, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was Isabel Hapgood, who was an Episcopalian woman, but was a translator of Russian literature. She translated Tolstoy and things like this. I think actually knew Tolstoy. And so she undertook this project to translate Orthodox services into English, in the first most complete collection of Orthodox services in English. And the project was begun under St. Tikhon's predecessor, Bishop Nikolai Ziora. He definitely supported it, was overseeing her translation and offering comments about different ways, some corrections and things like this. And then, once again, raised money to see its publication through finally in 1906. Yeah, there's when Sergei Witta, who was I think at that point maybe the prime minister in Russia, came to the United States for the ending the negotiations and the peace of the Russo-Japanese War. They signed the peace treaty in New Hampshire, and so I think Bishop Tikhon said to Sergei Witta, he says, okay, we need some money for this, and so once again, that was one of the sources of money. Yeah, so it was something he thought was really important. partially for the future of Orthodoxy, English language, and partially because he understood that there were Americans who were interested in Orthodoxy, and even if the services were in Slavonic, people, if they had the book, they could follow along and understand what was being said. Yeah.
I was just going to make a comment. I think we really owe St. Keith on a debt of gratitude for how he set the foundations for our church, which we still follow today. And many of the other Orthodox in this country have no idea of how we do things. You elect your bishops. It's just, just as the following. So, he was really a visionary in so many ways.
Yeah.
And I'm so thankful for that, because that is something we are direct beneficiaries of.
Yeah.
It's really set the family church.
Yeah. So many things that he, said and did were really kind of extraordinary, like ahead of their time. Something like this, and yeah. Well, thank you. Well, yeah.
I mean, it's kind of a stupid question, but since we were talking about money, for all the research and time and everything that you put into, and even getting access to all that you have to do this book, was that through the university, through where you work?
No, not primarily. A little bit, but not primarily. Most of this is federally funded grants. So research in this kind of field, the ability to travel, because I worked in archives all over Russia. I worked in Yaroslav, Pskov, and St. Petersburg, and Moscow. So to be able to do that is, federally funded grants, which unfortunately mostly have disappeared. I worked at something called the Kennan Institute in Washington, D.C., which was part of the Woodrow Wilson Center, which was also closed earlier this year. I finished writing the book on the grant from the National Endowment for Humanities, which has also lost a lot of its funding. So I wouldn't be able to, I don't know that I'd be able to do this project if I was starting now. Yeah.
What motivated you to write?
What's that?
What motivated you to write?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So, I also studied at St. Vladimir's Seminary, and, you learn about St. Tikhon as this incredible visionary, especially for the American church. And then, but my primary area of research is Russian history of the Russian Orthodox Church. So when I was finishing my first book, which was on the Trinity St. Sergius Monastery, kind of revival of monasticism in 19th century Russia, that collection of the secret police file was published. It was published in the year 2000, and I saw this, and I needed some documents for that first book, but I was like, this is just incredible, The only book, he's such an extraordinary person, right? Both contributed so much to the United States, to American Orthodoxy, but also, even just in secular terms, the head of the largest non-governmental organization in Russia at the time of the revolution, right? One of the most momentous events in world history. And the only book about him in English was published in the 1960s, a little thin book by Jane Swan, where she obviously didn't have access to these kind of materials that are now available. It's like, this is just unbelievable that such an important person in our church, but even just, again, in historical terms, such an enormously important person. Nobody's researched his life. It's just kind of like, if you're a historian, you look for something, A, is important, and B, nobody else has done before, or hasn't done in such a long time that, it's kind of like, man, how, it's sort of obvious sort of treasure. And the more I worked on him, just, the more extraordinary it sort of always seems to me.
How long did it take you to write?
Oh, a dozen years. I mean, along with teaching full time and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, so I've been working on it for that long.
So, just timing-wise, from St. John's passing, how long was it before St. John of Chicago went back to Russia?
So they returned in the same year,
Same year.
1907.
And then how long was it before he was martyred?
So Father John is the first martyr of the coming, of the Soviet Bolshevik Revolution. So already at the very end of 1917, I think in October, right? 1917, very beginning. St. Tikhon lives for another, whatever it is, 7 years.
And how did it work where St. John went back to? Like, how does that work with him being the rector of Trinity?
I mean, it was sort of understood for the most part that the priests who came from Russia it was like their tour of duty, that they would be in the United States for a period of time and then they would go back. And he was here for a particularly long time. So he'd come in 1895, if I remember correctly. So he was here for 12 years. That was longer than most. But many of them went back, around that time. I think in his case, in Father John's case, it was for also some family reasons. He needed to go back. His family needed him to be closer. So he required, request to transfer.
Well, I want to thank you so much for offering to come. Dr. Kimberly had contacted me, reminding me that he was going to be at the cathedral and asked if we would like to have him here give a presentation today, and I jumped at the opportunity. So again, I thank you for your generosity.
So I just want to thank you also for, thank you for asking the question for like why you did it, because that's incredible. It's just incredible. St. Tikhon and no one else has researched all of this.
Yeah. I mean, obviously in Russia, there's a university named after him, St. Tikhon's University in Moscow. So there's been, so there's much more written about him in Russia, but in the United States, there is one other person who will be publishing a book a year or so after mine, Francisca Solano. That was her doctoral dissertation a few years ago at the University of Toronto. Also, she really, really good, so I recommend. After you read my because they're different. We sort of work, once we realize we're both working on him, we kind of said, okay, we'll approach this differently.
We'll conclude with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. It is for me to bless you, Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure in the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim.
Thank you so much.